Welcome to the John Cady Podcast. I'm John Cady, U.S. Navy retired, former minister. I wasn't sure what I was going to talk about in tonight's podcast. Then I received an email from my youngest brother who lives in West Virginia. There was some breaking news today that a program, unbeknownst to most of us in this country, was started under the Biden administration that should send chills down every American's spine. I don't care what your political preference is, your religious preference, or lack thereof. The fact that the Biden administration was going to weaponize the Justice Department and the FBI to target people solely because their opinion, their ideology was different from the ruling party. What's the name of this program? It was called Operation Arctic Frost. In a congressional hearing today, Senator Charles Grassley announced that the results of the investigation are going to be made available for the American people, which I say, good on you, Senator. It needs to happen. Every American needs to know what is going on with this, because this piggybacks again onto the recent assassination of Charlie Kirk. And Charlie Kirk's program, Turning Point USA, which is one of the largest conservative organizations in the country and one that has played a major role in mobilizing younger voters to embrace conservative values and even go back to some of the founding principles upon which America was founded. This goes contrary to the far-left progressive views that some of those in Congress and previous administrations have held, most notably people like Senator Bernie Sanders, President Biden, President Obama, Senator Elizabeth Warren, Vice President Kamala Harris, and so on. What would have happened? This was brought up too. Before his death, Charlie Kirk was interviewed the night after the presidential elections. When he learned that President Donald Trump had been reelected, he said he breathed a sigh of relief because he feared that under a Kamala Harris administration, he would wind up in federal prison solely because he had an opinion that disagreed with hers. You know what other governments practice stuff like this? Despots, totalitarian regimes, communist countries all practice this type of mindset where they seek to not only weed out, but they also imprison, torture, and even execute people simply because their ideology differed from theirs and they were bold enough and brave enough to question the state in the process. One has to go back to the history of the Soviet Union, especially under Joseph Stalin. Under Joseph Stalin, he sent millions of Russians to the gulags because they wouldn't bow the knee to his communist regime. Mao Zedong in China, it's been estimated close to 60 million Chinese nationals were murdered, all in the name of pushing communism. And if you want to talk about a per capita cleansing of people because of their ideology, one can go to the brief but very brutal regime of Pol Pot in Cambodia. Pol Pot wiped out almost a third of Cambodia's population because they wouldn't bow the knee to his communist totalitarian principles. Countries that practice this type of mindset, also countries that practice Sharia law, you can't disagree with them. You can't speak your mind. There are no rights. Is this the future that we were going to have in America had Kamala Harris become president? The Heritage Foundation has stated in the past that the former vice president's leanings were even further to the left than socialist-turned-Democrat Bernie Sanders, further to the left than Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in New York. When we're talking about that type of ideology, people say that that person's leanings are left of Lenin, Lenin, as in Vladimir Lenin, not John Lennon, the musician. How close did we come in this country to dodging a bullet? No pun intended here. We dodged an ideological, political bullet in the presidential election. Say what you want about President Trump. President Trump may be many things, but he is not a dictator. If he was a dictator, he would have shut down a lot of this stuff that's been coming up against him. His programs would have gone through and the courts could have done nothing to stop him. Under our present system and the checks and balances that our judicial and legislative branches have, you still have those checks and balances in place. There will be opposition to certain policies that the Trump administration has brought forth. If you have a totalitarian regime, like in North Korea, like in Venezuela, like in Russia, you don't have that. Nobody can speak their mind. Nobody can say anything. And could you imagine what would have happened if Operation Arctic Frost had gone through to its conclusion? Think about all of our favorite conservative talk show hosts, commentators, analysts. They would have been rounded up and put in prison. The only one they wouldn't have put in prison was Rush Limbaugh, and that was because he passed away before President Biden took office. However, there are others. Mark Dice would have been rounded up. He probably would have been the first one to go to prison because his views were so much in opposition to that of the far left. Conservative talk show hosts like Michael Savage, people like Sean Casey and Bruce Elliott, the conservative commentators and hosts of the morning show on WCBM, that was a radio station I listened to frequently when I was in Baltimore. They would have been shut down. The station would have been forced to play state-approved programming. This is what would have happened under a totalitarian regime, because under such a regime, there would be no opposing voices. There would be no opposing views. Everything would have been towing the party line, and that's the party that's in power. And if we had gone down that path, any elections that we would have had from here on out would have been nothing but a joke, because the push was on to stack the ballots in certain states and populate states with people who would easily vote for those in the left. And thank God that his hand was still in this country enough to put Donald Trump back in office so that this disaster could have been averted. We should never take our freedoms for granted. Thomas Jefferson said that eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. We have to be vigilant. We have to stay focused and alert to what's going on around us. And if we see things that threaten our Constitution, that threaten our way of life, our ability to be free Americans, then by God, we have an obligation to say something and bring it to people's attention to where the proper actions can take place and our freedoms can be preserved, because otherwise, we're done. We're done as a country. Charlie Kirk breathed a major sigh of relief, and I'm sure that there are many others who are conservative, who are Christian, who are even in the center of the aisle, who were breathing a sigh of relief because they were still free to speak their minds and voice opposition. Under a far-left administration and a far-left legislature, that would have been game over. I'm very thankful that things happened the way they did. Yes, it's been rough, but I would rather live in dangerous liberty, as I've heard it said, than to be under peaceful slavery. This is John Cady. If you enjoy these podcasts, hit like, hit subscribe, and I will certainly catch you on the next one.